The Arizona Territory in 1878 was carved from dustbone and brutal truths. It taught you that silence could speak louder than sermons, that the horizon was full of lies, and that if God owned this land, he'd long since stopped collecting rent. For Elara Boone, a widow living 2 days' ride from the nearest town, these weren't just observations, they were survival. She thought she'd learned every cruel lesson this land had to offer until one night, the storm didn't fall from the sky, it rose from the blood-soaked ground at her doorstep. This isn't a tale of outlaws and six-shooters. It's about a vow muttered through cracked lips by a dying man, a promise that felt like a threat, and a prayer all at once. By dawn, you'll be my wife. And how that vow became more real than any law inked on paper. The wind came first, a low moan, curling over the chaparral, enough to make the cattle shift uneasily in the lean-to. Elara Boone stood on the porch, one hand shielding her face from the red dust twisting through the dusk, the other resting on the splintered handle of an old axe propped beside the door. Though it was still late afternoon, the sky had gone a wicked bruise color, dark and pulsing. The Chiricahua Mountains, usually her steady eastern comfort, were vanishing behind a wall of storm. It had been 14 months since Wren Mercer, her husband, succumbed to the fever. 14 months of silence, broken only by the cattle's lowing, the cause of restless crows, and the wind that never stopped scraping at her soul. At first the silence had stalked her like a predator, but she'd tamed it. Learned to fill it with the rhythm of work, fixing fences, tending her small garden, oiling Wren's rifle until it gleamed like the memory of the man who once held it. Her nearest neighbor lived a day's ride out, Dust Devil Creek, 2 days. She lived alone in a land that offered no mercy, and she'd made peace with that. The first raindrops came down heavy and cold, slapping the earth like angry hands. They carried the scent of ozone and wet creosote. Within moments, the storm hit full force. It wasn't rain, it was rage. A downpour so fierce it turned her yard to a river of mud and clawed at the shingles of her roof. She dropped the heavy crossbar across the door, lit her lantern, and settled in. These storms were reminders that nature ruled here, and no one got to forget it. For hours the tempest howled. Elara sat at her hand-carved table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold chicory brew, staring into the flickering lantern light. It was well past midnight when she heard something that didn't belong to the storm. A sharp crack, like a tree splitting, almost buried by thunder. A gunshot. She froze, heart thundering against her ribs. No one would be out in this. Not a rancher, not a bandit, not even a fool. She reached for Wren's Winchester with hands that knew what they were doing. She peered through a slit in the shutters, saw nothing but a wall of wind and black rain. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The storm began to lose its fury, settling into steady sheets of rain. Maybe she'd imagined it. Storms did that. Twisted the air, made familiar things feel wrong. But then she heard another sound. Closer. A dragging noise along the cabin wall, then a heavy thud on the porch boards. Like a body collapsing. A chill gripped her, colder than the storm. Her instincts screamed to stay put. Let the dawn deal with whatever had just died outside. But then she heard Wren's voice in her head, clear as if he were right beside her. You don't leave a man to die, Elara. Not even a dog. She took a breath that felt like swallowing. Iron lifted the crossbar and cracked the door open, rifle in hand. Lantern light spilled onto the porch, and there he was. A man face down in mud and water. Buckskin trousers clung to powerful legs. His bare back was a mess of red gashes. But it was the dark stains spreading from his side that told the truth. He was Apache. Long black hair, matted with blood and grit. Every story she'd ever heard, every warning whispered in town rose up in her chest. The Apache were ghosts to the settlers blamed for missing stock and sudden death. Danger incarnate. She should have bolted the door. Let the storm finish what it started. But then he groaned. a sound raw and broken agony in its purest form. Not savage, not monster, just man, dying. Alara's jaw clenched. She was Wren Mercer's widow, sure. But she was also the daughter of Warren Boone, a backwoods doctor who taught her that a wound didn't care what color your skin was. Damn it all to hell, she muttered a curse, and a prayer rolled into one. With the strength of someone who'd lifted more than her share of hardship, she dragged him inside. He was heavy muscle and bone limp with blood loss. Dead weight. And yet she didn't stop. She hauled him across the warped floorboards, streaking mud and blood behind them, and laid him out on the rag rug near the cold hearth. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected. Pain twisted his features, but the lines were strong. High cheekbones, a proud, hawk-cut nose. A long gash split the skin along his temple, but the true damage lay in his side. The bullet wound was ragged and torn, bleeding freely onto her floor. Fear fell away. Purpose took its place. Alara Boone fed the fire until the cabin filled with heat and light. She peeled away his soaked moccasins and leggings, her hands precise detached. His body was lean and iron-hard, mapped with old scars that spoke of hard seasons and harder fights. She set out what she needed: a basin of boiled water, clean cloths, carbolic soap, and the whiskey she kept for snakebite and long, lonely nights. As she cleaned the wound, he jerked violently. His eyes snapped open black as obsidian, and for a heartbeat they were sharp, burning with defiance and hate. His hand shot out and clamped around her wrist with brutal strength. The grip was iron. From his throat came a rasped warning, thick and guttural: enemy. "I'm not," she said, steady despite the tremor she felt. "I'm helping you. Lie still, or you'll bleed out on my floor." His gaze searched her face, hunting for deceit. He found none. Only a woman with tired green eyes, sure hands, and a jaw set like stone. The fire in his stare dulled, swallowed by the creeping fog of fever. His fingers loosened. His head fell back onto the rug. Alara worked for more than an hour cleaning what she could. She couldn't reach the bullet, but she packed the wound with yarrow and comfrey to slow the bleeding and fight infection. She splashed whiskey over the torn flesh. He arched with a soundless scream. Then she tipped a little between his lips. He coughed, then swallowed. Spent, she sat back on her heels. The stranger lived his breathing shallow but steady. Outside, the storm had burned itself out, leaving a deep, ringing quiet. In saving this man, this Apache warrior Alara, Boone knew she had invited a different storm into her home. Watching the slow rise and fall of his chest in the firelight, she had no idea how she would survive it. Dawn came soft and pale, washing the land in pink and gray. The world looked scrubbed clean, reborn. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with blood-bitter herbs and fevered heat. Alara hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in her rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap, watching him drift in and out. Each time he moaned, she snapped awake, her hand tightening on the stock. He was a coiled spring of violence, and only his unconsciousness kept her safe. As the morning wore on, the fever surged. He thrashed and muttered in a language she didn't know, short, harsh sounds that could have been orders or prayers. His skin burned. Alara worked without pause, cooling his face and chest with damp cloths, forcing sips of willow bark tea past cracked lips. She was tending a force of nature, a piece of the wild she'd spent her life holding at bay. She noticed the tattoo on his left shoulder, a stylized hawk with wings flared. Even in delirium, his muscles bunched with contained power. Who was he? Who had shot him? And who would come looking, his people or the men who put lead in his side? Either way, she was caught between. Mercy had made her a player in a deadly game whose rules she didn't know. For 2 days, he drifted on the tide of fever. Alara's world shrank to the cabin and the wounded man. She moved by habit: haul, water, feed the fire, change dressings, check the cattle, scan the horizon. The rifle stayed close. A strange detachment settled over her, as if she were watching herself from a distance. The sensible voice said she was a fool, that she should have left him to the storm. Another voice, older, harder, refused to let him die. On the third night, the fever broke. One moment he mumbled nonsense. The next his eyes were open and locked on her. The obsidian gaze was clear now, the delirium gone. No hatred remained, only a deep, bottomless weariness. She sat by the hearth, wiping soot from a lantern globe. Her hand froze mid-motion. The silence between them was absolute, a held breath between two worlds. He tried to sit up. A grunt tore from his throat. "Don't," she said, quiet and firm. "You'll tear the wound open." He ignored her, pushing onto one elbow, his face carved from pain. He scanned the small cabin with quiet intensity, the stacked firewood by the hearth, modest row of tattered books on the shelf, the faded quilt folded neatly on the narrow bed. Then his dark eyes drifted back to her. "Water?" He whispered, voice dry and cracked. Alara Boone fetched a dipper and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, never breaking eye contact. When he finished, he slumped back, breath ragged and uneven. "You are the white woman," he murmured. His English was thick with accent, but clear enough. Alara nodded slowly, surprised by his command of the language. "My name's Alara Boone." He seemed to roll the name in his mouth as if weighing it. "The soldier's bullet. It's still inside me. I know," she admitted quietly. "I couldn't get it out. It's buried too deep." Something flickered in his eyes. Not panic, not shock, something like resigned understanding. He knew what that meant. No doctor, no extraction. The lead would stay lodged in his body until it poisoned him from the inside out. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Why, he rasped, voice like dry leaves. "Why did you help me?" The question fell like a hammer in the hush between them. Alara looked down at her hands smeared with blood and garden soil. "My father, Warren Boone, he was a doctor. He always said a man who needs help is just a man. Doesn't matter who he is." He watched her in silence. The fire snapped and popped beside them, sparks leaping into the chimney. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, like he was measuring her, weighing her truth. When he finally spoke again, his voice dropped low, forcing her to lean closer. "My name is Tavak." "Tavak," she repeated softly. The syllables felt foreign and fierce on her tongue. He didn't speak for a moment, as if gathering what little strength the fever hadn't taken from him. His eyes, sharpened, suddenly locked onto hers with intensity that made her chest tighten. "You have saved my life." He said the words slow and deliberate. "You have cleaned my wound. You have touched my blood. You gave me your fire, your water." She nodded faintly, unsure where this was heading. "In my people's ways," Tavak continued, dropping his voice into a whisper, "when a woman does this for a warrior who is not her kin, she makes it on a claim. She binds his spirit to hers." A cold ripple ran through Alara. This was no superstition. It was something older, deeper, woven into the bones of a world she barely understood. I don't understand," she whispered, but part of her already did. Tavak's eyes held hers like a snare. Then his hand reached out, calloused fingers, brushing the back of hers. His skin burned hot against the cool air. "You have bound me." "Alara Boone," he murmured her name, a strange tenderness on his lips. "The debt is owed. By dawn, you'll be my wife." The word struck her like a slap. This wasn't a proposal. It wasn't born of passion or courtship. It was a sentence passed down by something older than laws. Was it a threat, a claim of control from a wounded man, desperate to survive? No. His face bore no lust, no pride, just a solemn, absolute certainty. She jerked her hand back like she'd touched flame. "No," she said, breath short. That's madness. I saved your life. That's all. It is never just that. Tavok murmured, a faint, grim smile touching his cracked lips, before pain twisted his face again. You've chosen. Now we'll face what follows. He let his head fall back, eyelids heavy. In seconds he drifted into exhausted sleep, leaving Alara frozen by the firelight, heart pounding beneath the weight of his vow. By dawn, you'll be my wife. The sun hadn't risen yet, and Alara Boone had never felt more like a prisoner inside her own home. When morning broke, the land outside her cabin was painted in soft hues of gold and gray, the storm-washed plains stretching quiet beneath the sun. But nothing felt the same. Alara stood on the porch, staring toward the mountains. Tavok's words rang in her mind like the clang of iron. By dawn, you'll be my wife. It was unthinkable. She was Ren Mercer's widow, a white woman, a settler. This was her land, her home, and yet, when she stepped back inside, she couldn't bring herself to see Tavok as a threat. His vow, as terrifying as it had sounded, hadn't been a claim of possession. It had been a fact, a law of his people, forged in blood and fire. He was barely hanging on to life, and in his world, the bond between them was already sealed. For days after, an uneasy silence settled over the cabin. Tavok was still too weak to move far, but the fever had lifted and his eyes were sharp again. They watched her, always. He watched her always. The way her fingers kneaded dough, firm and sure, the way her hands stitched up a tear in her skirt with even meticulous thread. He watched the way she read aloud from one of her worn books by firelight, her voice low and steady like a song half remembered. They didn't talk much. The quiet between them was a presence all its own. He never asked for anything, but Alara Boone brought him water broth and warm bread. He accepted each offering with a nod, quiet gratitude, silent recognition of his reliance on her. One afternoon, she sat cleaning Ren Mercer's Winchester. The familiar ritual gave her focus, steadied her breath. From where he lay, Tavok broke the silence. The man who taught you to use that, was he your husband? It wasn't a question. Her cloth stilled against the barrel. Yes, she said softly. His name was Ren. He passed last year. You move like a hunter, Tavok observed, not a settler. This land turns us all into hunters, she replied without lifting her gaze. Another day he watched as she struggled to reset a broken shutter. The storm had battered loose. After a moment, his voice cut in, calm and measured. That rope won't hold. It's frayed. Use a strip of hide. She blinked at him, surprised, then glanced back at the rope, realizing he was right. She fetched one of the spare leather straps she kept for mending tack and followed his advice. The new hinge held better, firmer, quieter in the wind. It was a small thing, but it was something. A crack in the wall between them. He saw the land like a living thing, its dangers, its rhythms, its signs. He belonged to it in a way she never could. She had settled it. He was born of it. The test of their fragile peace came a week after the storm. She spotted the dust trail before she saw the rider. It rose in the distance like smoke off a fuse. Her chest tightened. Alara turned on her heel and ran for the cabin. Inside, Tavok was already trying to rise, hand reaching for a blade that wasn't there. He moved on instinct. "Stay down," she hissed, grabbing the Winchester. "Get under that blanket and don't make a sound." For a second, fire sparked in his eyes. He wasn't built for hiding. He was a warrior, not prey. But when he saw the panic on her face, he understood. If someone saw him here, it would mean death for them both. He gave a grim nod and slipped beneath the coarse wool blanket, still as stone. Alara smoothed her dress, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and stepped out onto the porch face, composed every movement careful. The rider reined in, tall and lean, with pale hawk-like eyes and a drooping mustache that did nothing to soften the hard line of his mouth. Sheriff Gage Marlowe out of Dust Devil Creek. He didn't dismount. He just sat there, eyeing her homestead like a man measuring timber for sale. "Afternoon. Mrs. Boone," he said, voice flat as dust. "Sheriff," she answered evenly. "What brings you this far out?" she asked. "Duty," he said simply. Eyes drifting across the cabin, the lean-to, the far line of the ridge. "Always duty." "There was a scrap-up near Canyon Pass not long ago," he continued. "My men and I crossed paths with a few Chiricahua stragglers. We broke them up, but one slipped away. Took a bullet, I reckon. One of their leaders. Name's Tavok." A chill rolled down Ilara's spine. Her pulse beat loud in her ears, but her face stayed smooth. "I see. He's a bad one?" Marlowe went on, spitting tobacco off the porch edge. "Been raiding ranches near the border. There's a bounty, $500, dead or alive. He's on foot bleedin' bad. Might come looking for food or shelter." He leaned forward in the saddle, eyes narrowing. "You seen anything? Stranger who injured Indian?" Every instinct screamed, "This is your chance. Turn him in. Take the bounty. End this." Her debts would vanish. The fear would stop. It was the right play. The smart play. But when she looked into Gage Marlowe's cold, calculating stare, she thought of the man under the blanket. Tavok's bruised pride. His dignity. His strange binding vow spoken between pain and firelight. Yes, he was dangerous. But Marlowe, he was another kind of threat. The kind that came wearing a badge and riding in with the law. "No sheriff," she said, her voice clear. "Haven't seen a soul. Storm was the only visitor I've had all week." Marlowe studied her. His eyes narrowed to slits, reading her the way men read tracks. But Ilara Boone had learned how to bury fear deep. She didn't flinch. After a beat, he nodded. "All right, then." He tipped his hat with all the charm of a hangman. "Keep your eyes sharp. Wounded animals the most dangerous kind, especially the two-legged ones." He tipped his hat a motion, empty of courtesy, and turned his horse with a flick of the reins, riding off in a slow retreat. Ilara Boone stayed on the porch, watching until the sheriff's dust cloud blurred into the horizon. Her hands were trembling. She had crossed a line. She had lied to the law, sheltered a wanted man, and whether Gage Marlowe realized it or not, he was now her enemy. She stepped back inside and yanked the wool blanket off Tavok. He was already looking at her, something unreadable, flickering in his expression, part surprise, part something else. "You protected me," he said simply. "He would have shot you where you laid," she muttered, jaw tight. "And me too for helping you." "You are a strange woman, Ilara Boone," he said, voice low. "Just don't make me regret it," she snapped. The flood of adrenaline made her sharp and brittle. But as she hung the Winchester back on its wall pegs, her mind already knew regret was a luxury she no longer had. The lie to Gage Marlowe had sealed her to Tavok's fate. Their shaky truce had become something far more dangerous, a bond of secrecy and survival. That vow he whispered in the firelight no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a prophecy. The air inside the cabin had changed. The distance between them, once thick with suspicion, now buzzed with something sharper shared danger. They were no longer strangers. They were allies. Tavok began to heal, slowly, painfully. He started by sitting upright for long stretches, then bracing himself to stand leaning against the wall. Within days, he was limping around the cabin. Then he stepped out onto the porch, scanning the land, with sharp eyes, recognizing every slope, every shift of light. He began to give back. He taught her how to read the sky by the way the birds flew or how the clouds curled on the ridge, which roots could ease the stiffness in her hands and which crushed leaves could keep flies off her livestock. He carved a small bird from scrap wood, using her old knife. His hands, long and scarred, moved with surprising precision. In return, Ilara read to him at night. From her worn books, She gave him Shakespeare poems, sonnets. Her voice wrapped the room in something warm and unfamiliar. He sat quietly, but his eyes stayed on her, alive and thoughtful, following the rhythm of words from a world far from his own. These words he said one night, they paint behind the eyes. They were building something fragile word by word across the canyon of culture and blood between them. But shadows don't sleep forever. The past came back on horseback. A clear morning blue sky high when Rivenholt arrived. He was Ren Mercer's closest friend, big and broad-shouldered, with a hearty voice and kind eyes that had once brought comfort. His ranch lay a day's ride south. After Ren's death, Riven had helped her mend fences, calmed her livestock, and offered more than once to buy her out. She heard him before she saw him. Angel, he called as he dismounted, boots thudding in the dirt. Heard you hadn't been into Dust Devil Creek for supplies. Figured I'd check on you after that storm near tore the hills apart. Alara's stomach tightened like a fist. Tavok was inside. Riven, she greeted, forcing a smile, stepping down off the porch to meet him. Anything to keep him outside. I'm fine. Storm didn't do much. Nonsense, he said, removing his hat to swipe sweat from his brow. Woman out here alone. Not right. Ren to haunt me if I didn't check in. His eyes drifted to the leather hinge she'd fashioned. You fixed that yourself. Good work. I manage, she said, but her voice was tight. From inside the cabin, a board creaked. Riven's head turned slightly. You got company. Angel panic jolted through her. No, just the cabin settling. But Rivenholt hadn't lived this long by missing signs. His warm tone shifted. He glanced toward the door, eyes narrowing like a man hunting a lie. Alara, he said, voice lower now. Is everything all right? Before she could answer, the cabin door opened. Tavok stood in the frame. He leaned on a carved stick for support, one he'd whittled into a rough crutch. But he stood tall as he could manage. He wore a pair of Ren's old trousers and a shirt she'd given him. But no one could mistake what he was. His black hair hung long untamed. His dark eyes burned with that steady, unreadable fire. And in that instant, all of Riven's good humor bled from his face. His hand dropped to the revolver on his hip. Angel. Step away from him, he said hoarsely. Get behind me. No, Riven. It's not. That's an Apache, he growled. In your house. His gun came free from its holster hammer, clicking back like thunder. Is he holding you? Did he force you? Put the gun down, Alara snapped, stepping between them. He's hurt. I'm helping him. Rivenholt stared at her, like she'd gone mad. Helping him? His voice cracked. Angel, they're killers. Savages. Sheriff Marlowe was just in town, saying he's tracking a renegade up this way. At the mention of Gage Marlowe's name, Tavok stiffened. His grip tightened on the carved stick he used as a crutch. He was wounded. Riven, Alara said, her voice shaking. Left to die. I couldn't turn my back on that. Put the gun down, please. Riven's eyes flicked from her pale, desperate face to the proud, unyielding warrior behind her. He saw the way Tavok stood in the doorway, Ren Mercer's doorway, and the way Alara Boone stood between them, shielding him. A slow, painful realization settled in Riven's chest like cold iron. What's going on, Angel? He asked, his voice stripped of warmth. What have you done? I've survived, she snapped. Something you and everyone else seem to think I can't do on my own. Before Riven could respond, Tavok spoke calm and measured his words for Alara, but meant for the man before them. This man was your husband's friend, he said. But he sees only the ghost of the dead. He doesn't see you. The possessive, knowing weight of Tavok's voice sent a tremor through Rivenholt. Whatever hope he'd held for Alara was shattered in that moment. I see I'm not welcome, he muttered, holstering his pistol, though his movements were stiff with betrayal. I've been worried sick about you, Angel. I've done what I could, tried to honor Ren's memory by watching out for you. His voice cracked. But this is desecration. He swung up into his saddle, every motion bristling with anger and hurt. "Don't expect any more help from me. And when Sheriff Marlowe finds out, and he will, don't say I didn't try to warn you." He rode off without looking back, his silhouette swallowed in dust and silence. Alara stood frozen, a hollow ache blooming in her chest. Rivenholt had been her last thread to the world she used to know, her last tie to Ren, to normalcy. Now it was gone. She turned to Tavok, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "Now look what you've done." His gaze was grim. "He would have shot me dead if he'd found me alone. You know it. He would have taken the bounty and never looked back." He stepped toward her, pain marking every motion. "He is your past," Tavok said quietly. "I am your present." That night the air inside the cabin was brittle, charged with everything unspoken. The fragile peace had cracked wide open. Alara knew the truth. Riven in his wounded pride was now a danger. He might go straight to Sheriff Marlowe. She sat near the hearth, firelight flickering across the log walls. Her voice was hushed when she asked, "Why are they hunting you?" Tavok stared into the flames, shadows dancing across the angles of his face. "They lie," he said at last. "My people do not raid. We trade. We try to live on what little land hasn't been taken." He paused, jaw tight, voice darker. "But I was betrayed not just by the soldiers, by my own blood." He spoke of his cousin Voro, a man fueled by ambition and hatred. Voro had wanted the title of war chief, and he saw Tavok's talk of peace as weakness. "He told the soldiers where we'd be," Tavok said bitterly. "Promised them a chief's head. He thought I'd die and he'd take my place." His voice hardened. "But I ran. They shot me, but I didn't fall where they could find me. I ran. Through the storm. Until your light found me." Alara listened in silence. Her own grief over Riven's betrayal felt small now. Not meaningless, but dwarfed by the weight of Tavok's wounds. The kind that cut far deeper than flesh. They were two castaways from opposite shores, abandoned by the very people they once trusted. She looked at him, truly looked. Not as an Apache, not as a fugitive, but as a man who had crawled out of death into the home of a stranger and placed his life in her hands. His vow echoed in her mind. "By dawn, you'll be my wife." It no longer sounded insane. It sounded like inevitability. He had bound himself to her because he had no one left. And now, by choosing to protect him, she had bound herself to him. The breaking of her ties to Rivenholt wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. A final, irreversible beginning. But Rivenholt, as wounded as he was, didn't ride to Gage Marlowe. Not right away. He was a decent man at heart, and the thought of sending armed men to Alara's doorstep sickened him, no matter how bitter he felt. Instead, he rode into Dust Devil Creek and found a bottle. In the dim haze of the saloon, smoke curling through whiskey-stained air, he drank. Angry, ashamed, hurt. And little by little, with each glass, his tongue loosened. Not names, not facts, but whispers. That Angel Boone had lost her senses, that she'd taken in something dangerous, that she was living with a viper. He never said names, never gave details. But in a place like Dust Devil Creek, where gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire, in high wind, it didn't take much. The whisper hit the ears of Sable Winrow, the town's reigning queen of rumor. She recalled smoke curling from Alara Boone's chimney at strange hours, then passed it on to Bram Hargrove at the general store. Bram mentioned it to Flint Rourke, one of Sheriff Gage Marlowe's deputies. By sunset, the pieces had been stitched together, ugly and damning. Gage Marlowe wasn't the kind of lawman to believe in coincidence. A renegade slips through his fingers during a storm, and a week later, the lonesome widow out at Boone's Ridge suddenly has an old friend shouting about a snake in her house. The hunt was on. Back at the homestead, everything moved with urgency now. Words were few, glances sharp. Alara and Tavok worked in rhythm, tight, focused, deliberate. They were no longer a nurse and her wounded. They were two defenders bracing for siege. Tavok still wounded, but upright, moved like a man returned to purpose. He was in his element, again a warrior, setting ground for war. "This house is a trap," he said one afternoon, eyes scanning the lay of the land. "Too many windows, no exit." He led her outside, pointed toward the creek bed. "West it runs deep enough to hide a body. It gives cover. The ridge to the south, good for a lookout, but a man up there, he's easy pickings from the sky." He wasn't looking at a homestead. He was reading a battlefield. The world Alara had built, fence lines, gardens, feed bins, had turned to war map and kill zone under his gaze. Under Tavok's orders, they made ready. Alara hauled water from the well until every barrel was brimming. She baked what flour she had left into biscuits, hard as bullets. She took stock of her ammunition, laying out each precious cartridge in a line too few. Far too few. Tavok vanished for long hours, returning with hands stained by roots and sap. He moved rocks one at a time, arranging them in low walls that looked like nothing but gave cover. He dug a shallow trench behind the cabin, leading to a natural dip in the land. He was fortifying her home. With every stone he turned, her fear grew heavier. This was no longer a possibility. It was coming. That evening the sun stretched across the sky like a wound. They sat on the porch, the Winchester balanced across Alara's lap. Between them, there was quiet, an unspoken agreement that needed no words. "You should go," she said suddenly, the words thick like ash. "Tonight. While you still can. You're strong enough now. The mountains aren't far." Tavok didn't blink. His face in twilight was unreadable. "And what will you tell Gage Marlowe when he finds you alone?" "I'll say you overpowered me." "Escaped," she lied. He shook his head. "He won't believe it. He'll see what I've eaten. He'll see how far I've healed. He'll read the truth in your eyes." He turned to her. "And he'll hurt you to find what he wants." "It's my life," she fired back, her voice rising. "My home. I made the choice to help you. Whatever comes, I'll carry it." "You don't understand," he said, his tone low and fierce. He reached out and touched the wood stock of the rifle in her lap, his hand steady, warm. "When I woke in this place, I was already dead. My body broken, my spirit betrayed. You gave me back both." He held her gaze. "In my way of life, that means the life now belongs to you. It is my duty to protect you. That is what I carry." And there it was again, that vow. "By dawn, you'll be my wife." It had never been about possession. It was about protection. A life given back, owed in full. Not a burden for her to repay, but one he was bound by honor to bear. She looked into his face at the fierce loyalty shining in his eyes, and something inside her cracked. "We're going to die here, aren't we?" she whispered. Tavok's gaze slid toward the purple silhouettes of the mountains beyond. "All men die," he said quietly. "The question is, how do we meet it?" He turned back to her. "I won't die in chains. I won't hang from a rope. If I fall, it'll be standing. And I'll fall fighting for the woman who brought my soul back to life." The words didn't comfort her, but they did something else. They anchored her. And in that moment, Alara Boone knew she wasn't going anywhere. This was her land, and she would not run. She had chosen her ground. She had made her stand. The next morning they saw them, 3 riders in the distance. Black specks at first, creeping slow across the open plain. But even from miles out, their purpose was clear. They weren't passing through. They were coming for blood. Tavok appeared at Alara's side without a sound, moving like a shadow. Her breath caught in her chest. The time for preparing was over. They ran inside together. He grabbed the heavy oak table and with a grunt of pain, shoved it hard against the door. Then he checked the shard of mirror he'd wedged high on the wall, angled just right to see the backyard without being seen. Alara rushed to the front window, easing the shutter until only a thin slit of light peeked through. She slid the Winchester into the gap. The cool metal pressed against her cheek. She saw them clearer now. Sheriff Gage Marlowe led the way, flanked by two familiar figures, Flint Rourke and Thorne Kess. Both deputies from Dust Devil Creek. The law had come. The world shrank to the size of her cabin. Outside, men with badges, guns, and legal cause to kill. Inside, a wounded Apache warrior and a widow who had risked everything for a promise made in fire and fever. The riders kept coming. Each hoofbeat was a hammer in Alara's chest, drumming out the final moments of the life she once knew. "Stay away from the windows," Tavok growled, voice low and sharp. "He'll want to see who's inside. Don't give him that." She stepped back, pulse thundering in her ears. The three riders slowed and stopped 200 yards out, just beyond the edge of pistol range. They sat their horses like carved statues, a grim trinity, beneath a wide, merciless sky. Alara Boone. Marlowe's voice cracked the air like a whip, sharp and dry, carried on the wind. "I know you're in there, and I know you ain't alone." He paused. "Send out the Apache. Do it now, and I'll speak to the judge for leniency. You've got my word." Alara turned to Tavok. His face was hard stone, but his eyes flicked constantly, calculating, reading every beam, every angle, every risk. "He's lying," Tavok said under his breath. "He wants me. That bounty's no good if I'm shot in the crossfire. He won't risk a stray bullet." Silence thickened between the walls. Marlowe waited. Then he shouted again, this time louder, edged with threat. "I'm coming in. If he's holding you hostage, drop to the floor." Outside, they heard the jingle of spurs. The riders dismounted, leaving one to hold the horses. The others began to move and splitting apart, using rocks and brush for cover. They moved like hunters, like men who'd cornered a kill. The one on the left, Tavok whispered, nodding toward the slat in the shutter. "He's younger. Less sure of himself. What are you saying?" Alara murmured, her knuckles white around the rifle. "When the shooting starts, he'll panic. He'll run for deeper cover. That's when he's exposed." The thought of firing on a town deputy turned her stomach. She'd seen them in town. Faces she'd nodded to. Men who tipped their hats. But that was before. This wasn't about laws or right and wrong anymore. This was survival. The two advancing riders reached the edge of her garden, the same stone wall she once used for tomatoes. Now it was a firing line. "Last chance," Boone Marlowe bellowed. Tavok gave her a single sharp nod. "Now." Alara took a breath, steadied the rifle aimed low, not at the men, but at the dry ground just in front of them, and pulled the trigger. The explosion inside the cabin was deafening. The bullet ripped through the air, kicked up a spray of dust and grit just feet from their boots. Both men dropped, instantly flattening to the earth. The siege had begun. "Reload," Tavok said calmly, as if they were training. He gripped Ren Mercer's old six-shooter, holding it like it had never left his hand. Shots cracked from outside one, then another. A bullet punched through the wall near the hearth, spraying chips of wood. Another shattered the last unbroken pane of glass. They were trapped, returning fire from inside as Marlowe and his man hunkered behind the garden wall. A standoff, but one they couldn't afford to drag out. They had only so many bullets. No backup, no escape. Marlowe had time, all the time in the world. The sun climbed. The air inside the cabin turned thick and stifling. They drank water sparingly, each sip gritty with fear and dust. Every so often the deputies fired a shot, forcing Alara and Tavok to stay low, reminding them who held the ground. "They'll wait for dark," Tavok said at last, voice hoarse. "When it comes, they'll try to burn us out." And Alara Boone knew in her bones. He was right. The thought of fire being burned alive inside her own walls terrified Alara Boone more than any bullet. Afternoon shadows stretched long across the land when they heard it Another rider coming fast. She glanced through the crack in the shutter. One horse, one man. It was Rivenholt, no rifle in hand, both arms raised high above his head as he galloped straight toward the standoff. "Marlowe, hold your fire," he shouted. "It's me, Rivenholt. Let me talk to her." There was a reply, sharp-clipped, but Alara couldn't make out the words. Riven dismounted, his hands still raised, walking slow into the scorched yard. "Alara," he called out, his voice tight with grief and fear. "This has gone too far, darling. Please, give him up. I told Gage it was my mistake. I was drunk. I ran my damn mouth. Just send the Apache out. It's not too late." Beside her, Tavok stood still as stone. His voice was low but sure. "He's lying to save you. But Marlowe, he won't care." "Riven, go home," Alara shouted through the door. "I'm not leaving you." He yelled back, his face a wreck of pain and panic. "Don't do this. I told them you were just confused. You've been out here alone too long." He stepped forward. From behind the garden wall, Flint Rourke, young and rattled, flinched at the movement. He raised his rifle. "Don't," Marlowe barked. Too late. The shot rang out. Rivenholt crumpled with a cry, hitting the dirt, hard, clutching his thigh. Alara screamed. Rage erupted in her chest like wildfire. They'd shot Riven. Her friend. Ren's friend. Fear turned to fury, ice-cold and blinding. She jammed the Winchester through the shutter, found her target, and squeezed the trigger. The younger deputy shrieked, his rifle falling as he stumbled back, grabbing his shoulder. She'd hit him. Tavok moved instantly, with Marlowe distracted, torn between his downed man and his wounded ally. Tavok slipped to the rear of the cabin, disappearing into the trench he'd carved days ago. He melted into the shadows like a ghost. Alara Marlowe roared, "You're done. You just shot a lawman." She ignored him, hands shaking as she reloaded, sweat trickling down her back. Then the next shots came not from the front, but the south ridge. Boom. Crack. Boom. High ground. Return fire. Tavok. He had circled through the creek bed and taken the ridge. He was drawing their fire, flanking them from above. Marlowe and Thorne Kess scrambled for cover, bullets whipping past them. They fired wildly toward the rocks, but it was clear they were caught in a trap they hadn't seen coming. And Tavok's plan was crystal clear now. He wasn't fighting to win. He was giving her a way out. He was sacrificing himself, his life, his shield for the woman who had given him a second chance. Dusk settled like smoke. The firing slowed. The lawmen were too busy trying to pin him down to focus on the cabin. And then she saw it, a flicker just beyond the ridge. Tavok slipping into the open plains, using the chaos and darkness like a cloak. He wasn't running to hide. He was drawing them away. From her. From the house. From everything. He had promised to protect her. And this was how. Then Marlowe's voice echoed again, farther off now. Thinner on the wind. "He's on the move. After him. Forget the woman. The bounty's getting away." The thunder of hooves tore through the night. The posse galloped away, chasing the man they thought they had cornered. And just like that, they were gone. Silence settled. A deep, ringing silence. The kind that feels holy. Only the low groans of Rivenholt, lying wounded in her yard, reminded Alara the fight had been real. The siege was over. She lowered the rifle, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had passed. The cabin was in ruin. Bullet holes riddled the walls, the windows were gone, furniture overturned, but it was still standing. She was still breathing, but Tavok was gone. He had kept his word. Whether he'd been gunned down, or was now forever running across the wide blood-red horizon, he had honored his vow. He had given his life to save hers. And that sacrifice, terrible and beautiful, pressed on her chest like both a burden and a blessing. She was alone again, but no longer the same woman who'd opened her door to a wounded storm. The night stretched long, ringing with silence, broken only by the pained moans of Riven Holt. Alara Boone knelt beside him, cleaned his wound, a messy but survivable shot, and listened as he murmured fevered apologies, choked with shame. By morning, as the gray light filtered in, it laid bare the wreckage. The bullet-scarred walls, shattered glass, overturned chairs. And Alara, with quiet resolve, began to reclaim her home. While sweeping away the splinters near the hearth, her broom nudged something small and smooth. She bent and found the carved wooden bird Tavok's handiwork left behind like a final heartbeat. She closed her hand around it, fingers tightening until the edges bit into her palm. It was real. So was the cost. 2 days later, Riven Holt, pale but upright, was strong enough to ride. "You were right," he told her, voice thick with regret. "I was a fool." He looked down at his bandaged leg, then off toward the horizon. Marlowe won't be back. His posse lost Tavok's trail in the Badlands. They're too proud to admit it, so they're telling folks he bled out. Said the coyotes finished the job. He looked at her with soft pleading. "Come back with me. Leave this place. Leave what happened behind." But the answer was already in her eyes. "My place is here, Riven." And in that moment he finally saw it. The woman standing before him wasn't the same widow he'd tried to protect. That woman was gone, burned away in the fire of siege. What remained was someone forged from grit and loyalty. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving behind a cabin that no longer held loneliness, only stillness. Seasons passed. 1 year turned into another. Alara Boone rebuilt, fence by fence, board by board. Her hands moved with confidence, purpose, memory. The scars on her walls, bullet holes, and splintered beams were never patched. They were history now, proof she'd stood her ground. The silence of the plains returned. But it wasn't empty anymore. It watched her. It breathed with her. Now and then, signs would appear. A quail feather on her porch rail. A fresh deer left near the well. She never saw a soul, but she didn't need to. He was out there, keeping his word. Her world no longer ended at the fence line. It reached into the wild, into the canyons and ridges where he'd vanished, into the places where promise lives in shadow and wind. One morning, as dawn painted gold across the Chiricahua Mountains, she stood barefoot on the porch, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the rising light. That vow, whispered in fever and desperation, had not been a sentence for one sunrise. It had been a covenant for all the dawns to come, a bond not of law nor paper, but of blood and defiance. She slipped her hand into her pocket and felt the small wooden bird. And she smiled, not because she was waiting, but because she was already living the story they had written. And that, folks, is the story of Alara Boone and the Apache warrior named Tavok, a tale born from dustfire and the brutal beauty of the American West. A story that asks, what truly binds two people together? Is it a preacher's blessing, a wedding band, or is it something wilder? Their bond wasn't sealed with vows spoken beneath a steeple. It was forged in fire, in gun smoke, in sacrifice. A marriage of action, unwritten but unshakable. A promise kept when everything else had fallen apart. If this tale of resilience, alliance, and unspoken love stirred something in you, don't just ride off into the sunset. Hit that like button if you want to see more Western stories with real heart and grit. Share this with someone who knows that the wildest love stories aren't written, they're survived. Subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss our next journey into the triumphs, betrayals, and quiet truths of the past. Thank you for listening. We'll see you on the trail. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts, as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.